The movie opens focusing on Charles Blakey, an African-American man deeply troubled by debt. We find him drinking and playing cards with his friends, Ricky and Clarence. Charles is facing foreclosure. The bank is about to seize his house if he fails to pay his loan on time. His friends try to convince him to find employment, and Ricky even offers to connect him with construction work. However, Charles merely says maybe. This response irritates Clarence, who calls Charles ungrateful and questions if Charles believes he is some kind of prince who doesn't need to work for a living. Charles responds with a harsh insult, which quickly escalates the argument into a physical fight. Ricky steps in to calm the situation down and separates them. Before leaving, Clarence angrily tells Charles that he hopes the bank takes away his house. The following morning, Charles is visited by a man he doesn't know. The visitor introduces himself as Anniston Bennett and immediately starts asking questions about the basement. Charles insists that his house is not for sale. The man surprisingly tells Charles that he only wants to rent the basement space for a limited time. Charles still refuses the offer. Anniston then leaves his business card and asks Charles to contact him if he changes his mind later. Charles attempts to make breakfast shortly after, only to realize he is almost completely out of groceries and lacks the money to buy even a loaf of bread. His car is also running very low on fuel, and he has no means to pay for a refill. The desperate Charles then goes to the construction site where his friend Ricky is working, but they refuse to hire him. Afterward, Charles goes to meet a relative who is a bank employee, but she has grown tired of consistently helping him. She informs him that the bank has decided to seize his home to recover the money owed, which he believes is actually for the best. Despite this huge setback, Charles refuses to surrender and calls his aunt to ask for some financial assistance. She is furious that he is losing a house that has been in the family for 8 generations. She is also deeply disappointed that Charles only ever calls her when he needs something from her, and she refuses to help him this time. With all his other options exhausted, Charles dials Anniston's number and leaves a voicemail expressing his interest in discussing the rental proposal. He then walks to his backyard, which is actually a cemetery where members of his family are buried. He continues walking until he reaches the basement. Charles is shocked to find the body of a dead dog lying there, which appears to have been left abandoned for a very long period. The next morning, he calls Ricky for help clearing out the basement, which contains numerous old, stored items. Charles insists his plan is to simply throw everything away, but Ricky argues that these old antiques could be worth a significant amount of money and suggests they sell them instead. Ricky knows a person who can connect him with a local antique dealer in exchange for a 10% commission fee. A woman named Narcissus arrives. She carefully looks around the basement and is amazed by several unique items, many of which look to be centuries old. Later, Narcissus discovers a collection of ancient masks and tells Charles that his ancestors must have brought them over from West Africa. Charles is distracted by strange noises coming from upstairs and pays little attention. Narcissus assures him that he could earn between $40,000 and $100,000 for all the items, excluding the masks. She adds that she will return soon to take professional pictures of everything, and in the meantime, he must keep the masks near him. That evening, Charles receives a call from Anniston. Anniston states he requires the basement for exactly 65 days and offers to pay $65,000 for the total lease period. Hearing this large sum, Charles is in utter disbelief, as he had not anticipated such a high payment. Anniston explains he will pay $10,000 as a deposit, $25,000 when he moves in, and the remaining half when the lease ends, all in cash. He then warns Charles not to tell a single person about their arrangement, which Charles agrees to immediately and without question. The next day, Charles receives a large delivery for the basement. He sees that Anniston has sent many supplies for his stay. Anniston has also sent some cash, which makes Charles feel great joy. Without wasting any time, Charles goes straight to the bank and confronts a banker, humiliating him before paying off all of his outstanding debts. He also fills his car with gasoline and completely stocks the refrigerator with groceries. Days later, Charles drives to a train station to pick up Anniston. Once they arrive back at the basement, Anniston offers Charles a glass of expensive whiskey, and they begin getting to know each other. Charles asks Anniston about his business. The old man explains that he runs a reclamation process, which involves searching for valuable treasures like diamonds located beneath someone's property. He then acquires the property and contacts those who can mine it, earning himself a large commission. Anniston hands Charles the agreed-upon $25,000 payment, after which Charles leaves Anniston alone and heads upstairs. The next morning, when Charles returns to the basement with a coffee, he is horrified to discover that Anniston has constructed a cage, complete with a toilet, and locked himself inside. The old man explains that he wants to completely isolate himself from the outside world and asks Charles to bring him meals every day while he focuses on reading and writing. Charles finds this behavior bizarre and refuses. Anniston then asks if he can stay for a minimum of 2 weeks. After that period, if Charles still wants him gone, Anniston will leave. However, if Charles allows him to stay, Anniston promises to double the final payment. Charles reluctantly agrees to the new terms. Anniston gives Charles the key to the cage to ensure he cannot get out on his own. To prevent being caught in this strange situation, Charles locks the basement doors securely and even covers the windows so that nobody can see Anniston inside. That evening, Charles brings the old man his food and also provides him with a flexible faucet to use for washing his dishes. The following day, Charles visits a local library and decides to search the internet for information about Anniston, but he finds no relevant results. He returns home and spends his time engaging in philosophical discussions with the old man. At one point, Charles asks Anniston if he has ever traveled to Africa. When Anniston confirms that he has, Charles shows him the antique masks and asks if Anniston knows anything about them. Anniston asks Charles for a pocket knife, and when he carefully scrapes off some of the paint on the mask, it reveals shining gold underneath, leaving Charles completely stunned. In the next scene, Charles arrives at Narcissa's house and shows her the gold-plated mask, which also shocks her greatly. He suggests he might not be the only person with such treasures, and that there could be other people, too. He proposes a business deal. They could drive around and offer their services to other families, going through their old antique items for a commission percentage. But Narcissa strongly refuses the idea and is annoyed that Charles wants to turn his family heritage into merchandise. That evening, Charles returns home very late and finds Anniston furious because he has not received any food all day. A frustrated Charles snaps back, demanding to know why Anniston is hiding here, and asks directly if he is a criminal. Shockingly, Anniston admits that he is one, but swears that no law enforcement is currently pursuing him. Charles pressures him to reveal what he has done, but Anniston refuses to say anything, simply reminding Charles not to forget his meals again. Later, while Charles is cleaning up, he suddenly notices his skin peeling away, showing a thick layer of gold underneath. But when he looks again, his skin is back to normal, and he dismisses the experience as a hallucination. The next evening, Charles spends some time drinking with his friends and apologizes to Clarence for their earlier fight. While driving home, Charles closes his eyes and removes his hands from the steering wheel, appearing as though he wants to end his life. All of a sudden, the shocked man rushes out of the car to check. Seeing a lifeless animal, he is overwhelmed with guilt. Upon returning home, Charles tells Anniston that their 2-week trial period is almost finished, and Anniston must leave afterward. Here, a desperate Anniston decides to reveal some shocking information. He says his first job was as an accountant in Tehran. To test his loyalty, his employers once took him to a cell and ordered him to kill a man, which he carried out without any hesitation. Charles is horrified by this confession and realizes Anniston came here hoping to find redemption, especially since the dead man was also black. Charles is now even more determined than ever to force Anniston out of his house. However, Anniston argues that he knows Charles still needs the remaining money. Anniston then suddenly narrates Charles's life story in detail, including where Charles attended high school, became a football star, and only got into an average college because of his sports skills. He reveals that Charles's father died young, and after college, Charles came home to take care of his mother. When she passed away, Charles had to look after his uncle Brent, who was known to be very cruel. Anniston even knows that Charles once worked at a bank, where he stole $433 and got fired, leaving him bankrupt and buried under a huge $68,000 mortgage. In a shocking twist, Anniston reveals that it was actually him who offered a very high price for the house and pushed the bank to start the foreclosure proceedings against Charles. Hearing all of this, Charles is horrified and resolves to kick Anniston out right away. Anniston argues again that Charles' situation will not change whether he remains or leave the house. A frustrated Charles decides to give Anniston a real punishment. He declares that from that night forward, Anniston is his prisoner, and Charles is the warden. The enraged Charles then turns off the basement lights and storms upstairs. The following morning, Charles returns to the basement and tells Anniston that from now on, everything, food, water, books, and even lights, will be treated as a privilege. He explains that he will ask a series of questions, and if he dislikes the answers, one privilege will be removed. Anniston has only one right. He can ask to be released at any time, and Charles will let him go 96 hours after the request. Anniston then adds condition. After Charles asks 3 questions, Anniston will ask one question of his own, which Charles must answer honestly. They begin their question and answer session. Anniston reveals he is an American citizen and was born in the U.S. Next, Charles asks him if he has ever murdered anyone. The old man responds no, explaining that he only shot and killed that man in Tehran, while following orders from legal government representatives. Anniston then asks Charles the same question, to which Charles responds no, before he leaves the basement. The next morning, Charles spits into Anniston's coffee cup before they resume their Q&A session. Charles asks how Anniston makes his money. The old man explains that individuals, corporations, and sometimes entire governments pay him to obtain and reclaim properties that are meaningful to them, and sometimes this process can be illegal. When Charles asks why Anniston specifically chose his house, Anniston reveals that Charles was a perfect specimen, a lonely black man with huge debt and a sizable basement. Anniston even calls him the perfect failure of their race, which so completely enrages Charles that he turns off the lights and says he will not return for 4 days. That evening, Narcissus comes to visit Charles and tells him she has a proposal. She asks Charles if he would be interested in opening an African-American museum where they would display his ancient relics along with some antique items from her own store. This approach would allow Charles to earn money without needing to give up his family heirlooms. Charles agrees to the plan. They begin joking and discussing possible names for the antique masks. One thing leads to another, and they begin kissing, but their romantic moment is quickly interrupted when they hear strange screaming sounds. Charles claims it is just a fox outside and says he will chase it away, but he knows the screaming is actually Anniston in the basement. Charles quickly sends Narcissus away, claiming it is too late, something she finds very rude. Days later, Charles finally goes to visit Anniston, who thanks him and says that the 96-hour count for his release has begun. Anniston reveals how all the people he killed and tortured came to him during the darkness. He then begins recounting all the horrible atrocities he has committed, including the time he fed a 9-month-old baby to a hungry dog because someone ordered him to do it. However, he tries to justify himself, claiming that he has also saved thousands of lives and that the baby would have died eventually anyway. Hearing this, Charles is deeply shaken and immediately prepares to leave. Even though Anniston begs him not to cut off the light, Charles refuses and switches off the light bulb. That evening, Charles arrives at a party being held by his close friends, where he notices Narcissus is also present, and the two stare awkwardly at each other. Frustrated, Charles starts drinking heavily and soon hallucinates seeing a strange dog, which prompts him to quickly flee the party. Charles soon returns to his house and senses someone's presence, so he arms himself with a shovel. He looks around carefully and notices the television is turned on. As he moves closer, he watches a montage of several clips showing the suffering and historical pain of black people throughout history. His hands suddenly appear bloody, and he sees the same dog devouring the innocent deer he once accidentally hit. The dog starts barking, and a terrified Charles runs upstairs and hides underneath the bed. Moments later, a man, who is revealed to be his dead Uncle Brent, enters the room, intending to beat Charles for his bad behavior. This is clearly a hallucination, but it heavily suggests that Brent was an abusive person who frequently beat Charles during his childhood. Before Brent can reach him, Charles runs away from the house while recalling his difficult teenage years and soon falls into the sea. While he is in the water, he sees a woman nearby who appears to be his mother. Later on, Charles returns to his house and heads to one of the rooms, where he sees his uncle dying and begging desperately for help. Charles breaks down in tears and feels his mother's hand on his shoulder, after which he finally leaves the room. Disturbed by all these events and visions, he finally decides to visit Anniston, but he finds the old man in a horrible, filthy state. Anniston immediately threatens to kill him, so Charles warns him that if he does that, they would both end up dead. Here, Charles demands that Anniston tell him his real name, or he can go back into the darkness. When asked his true name, Anniston reveals that his birth name is Tamal Nosos, but that he never knew his biological parents. His birth certificate lists his mother, Maria Nosos, as Greek and unmarried, while his father appears only as Tamal, with Turkish nationality. Anniston then removes his blue contact lens and explains that when he grew up, he gave himself a new name and adopted the surname Bennett from a very powerful British family. Hearing this, Charles begins mocking him, saying that since he never knew his father, he could be anything, such as Arab, Indian, or even African. Anniston angrily insists that he is as white as the sun. After this intense exchange, Charles surprisingly calms down and gives the old man a needed bath and some food before finally providing a new light bulb and a book to read. Afterward, Charles finally admits his own darkest secret. He killed his uncle by simply letting him die. He reveals how angry he was that he had been left alone in the house to care for the man he had hated for his entire life. And so, he stopped answering his uncle's calls. Eventually, those calls turned into desperate screams, which Charles deliberately ignored. Charles waited for the screams to completely stop, and in the end, his uncle passed away because of neglect. Anniston is completely stunned to hear this story, and it is clear that Charles has been overwhelmed with intense guilt ever since the incident. The next morning, Charles finally decides to fully vacate his uncle's room. He notices a little girl in a dog mask outside, who glances at him briefly before leaving. He then heads to the basement with a meal for Anniston, only to find the old man lying motionless, dead. Anniston has left a letter, explaining that he came here searching for answers in books, but ultimately discovered the true answers about himself while trapped in the darkness. Charles buries Anniston in the cemetery in the yard, placing him alongside his own family members. Additionally, Anniston had left letters to be delivered to his business associates and family members so they could mourn him, but Charles doesn't care and burns them all instead. Anniston also left a red pill specifically for Charles, which would grant a fast and painless death if Charles ever chooses to use it. However, Charles decides to choose a different, more purposeful path in life. He and Narcissus transform his house into a museum, where they display the ancient relics for the world to see and appreciate. The movie ends with Charles living in the basement cage, reading books, and beginning his personal journey of redemption.